Welcome to Driven by Data, Conversations Shaping Safer Roads. This is WDM's podcast series, and we're on episode 2, Skid Resistance Strategies, Turning Data into Safer Roads. Stay tuned, as today we're exploring skid resistance strategies, how SCRIM surveying supports evidence-based maintenance, and why good data is fundamental to proactive asset management. Stay with us as we discuss how local authorities can use friction data more strategically and how objective analysis helps deliver safer, more resilient road networks. I'm with Mark Stevenson, Director of Consultancy at WDM. Hi, Mark.
Hello, Abby.
And today we're going to talk about skid resistance and SCRIM. So, Mark, let's start with the fundamentals. What do we mean by skid resistance?
So, when we use the term skid resistance, we are really talking about the contribution the road surface makes to the frictional properties between the tyre and the road surface. So we're trying to isolate out the element of the road surface that contributes to skid resistance. And essentially that's how we stop, manoeuvre, turn around corners, etc.
Skid resistance really is very kind of fundamental to how we kind of travel around on the road. Can you tell us a bit more about how it contributes to road safety?
Yeah, I'd probably like to frame it in terms of the safe systems approach. So you're looking at safe road users, safe vehicles, and safe roads. Mm-hmm. And the safe roads are really about how we use the vehicles on the road network, and it captures a lot of things. But the fundamental of how the tyre interacts with the road surface, enabling you to do everything that you do when you're travelling, is really an underpinning part of a safe system approach to managing safety on the network.
And really the safe systems approach is something that everybody should be thinking about when they're managing their road network. Is that right?
Yeah, I think a lot of authorities have signed up to it, and national governments have signed up to it. And there's a premise that we need to protect the road users because we're vulnerable and we won't withstand the forces of a crash. Mm-hmm. So the safe systems approach tries to look at all of the contributing elements to that, to look at how we manage safety, and we don't look at it in isolation about airbags in vehicles, but forget that you have to enable the vehicles to stop safely.
In terms of how the industry is evolving then, because obviously the roads are getting busier, and there are more cars on the road. So obviously there's a scope for a lot more kind of incidents whereby we need to manage our skid resistance. Can you talk a little bit about how the industry's approach to skid resistance management has changed over the years?
Yeah. I'll reflect on my own experience. So starting off as a design engineer, determining what materials you use for a surface course, so the top layer of the road construction, and probably through the 80s we were very much specification driven. So if you use material with these properties, it should perform to a level that provides you the required skid resistance. And my recollection was it wasn't a particularly scientific approach. You'd ring up typically the materials engineer and he would say, use this number, without necessarily knowing what the number meant. And that then determined what you were laying down on the road surface. Through the 90s, I think we got more into the measurement process. So that was where SCRIM came in and you were able to do network testing. So the first approach is safety through design. Mm-hmm. But you know that the performance of a particular aggregate on the road can vary significantly. So the monitoring then became a process of saying, what is the actual performance of the network? Is it adequate for the maneuvers that you're expecting vehicles to use in a particular location. So you got this report, you got the reporting where you'd get a snapshot of your network saying this is the skid resistance profile. And there was an element then of just go and do stuff without really being clear on the process to decide the priorities. And I think through probably the early 2000s, that became wrapped up much more in policy and procedures to say, what are the standards? What are your investigatory protocols, and how do you decide what to do and what not to do? Because the profile of most local authority networks is there's significantly more that's below investigatory level than you can treat within normal programs. So you have to have a process of prioritization and determining where intervention's required and where you might use ongoing monitoring as the process.
Let's move on to kind of how local authorities currently kind of strategize their skid resistance. Some of them still see SCRIM as just an annual exercise, surveying exercise, but how should they really be thinking about their skid resistance or skid management strategies?
Yeah. I'll talk through the situation in England first, and then I might touch on Scotland, because there's a slightly different legal framework around. So England have the English local authorities have a reporting requirement. So they are obliged to report the proportion of their road network that's below an investigatory level. So there is a small number of authorities who see it as a reporting exercise primarily, and they'll report their percentage, and they don't necessarily then go in and analyse and use their data. I think that the more developed skid policies look more closely at what is the skid resistance. They might look at it with other data sets, possibly crash data, speed data, and other things, and start to frame a policy or a strategy where you're looking at sites that are flagged through the surveys, you're carrying out an investigation, and then you're effectively making a judgment on, are the conditions of that site such that it warrants an intervention by improving the skid resistance? Or indeed, it could be something completely different. So it might be some routine maintenance, improve the drainage, renew road markings, put signing up. Yeah. But it's that process of investigation and carrying out an action. One area that you get very mixed practice is how skid resistance surveys or the works resulting from it are budgeted. So some authorities will top slice a budget and they'll say, we've got a finite amount of money we're going to spend on skid resistance intervention. Others will mix it into a wider program. Both will work. I do quite like the premise of top slicing monies because it focuses the attention. It's an approach that's widely used in New Zealand, where they'll top slice the budget for the particular skid resistance program. In Scotland, the legal framework is slightly different. So in England, there is a duty to maintain the highway, framed by the Highways Act, and there's a process of demonstrating that you're doing that in a reasonable fashion. In Scotland, the duty is much more a common law duty, so it's not framed quite in the same way. And I think as a consequence, we tend to find that the English authorities maybe more policy driven, more documenting their processes and having the records that may stand up to scrutiny if they did get a claim or a police investigation.
What does an effective skid resistance strategy actually look like?
Yeah, I think that there are national standards and you can look at and adopt a national standard. But the national standards are largely derived for the strategic road network, which is very different to most local authority networks in that it's usually engineered to mitigate risk. So the first point I would say is you have to have an internal discussion about whether to adopt that or to look at local variation. I would always advocate that variation from national standards ideally should be evidence-based, so you can look at the performance of your network, the profile of your network, and there's lots of different analytical methods and approaches to do that. I then think you've got the survey strategy, so how far down your road hierarchy do you go? A lot of authorities might just do their A roads, but they could have B roads that have significant risks by virtue of alignment or usage. So I think you've got to determine the survey strategy. And I think one of the core elements is once you've done the survey, once you've received your data, what do you do with it? Yes. And it's that process of analysis, investigation, and prioritization to turn a lot of sites into a program of works where you're confident that you are going to get benefits.
There's a lot to think about when we talk about skid resistance strategies. And I just want to understand a little bit more about how skid resistance data can fit within kind of the wider asset management and lifecycle planning.
Yeah. Okay. So when we carry out the SCRIM surveys, they are fitted to the same network that other surveys would be fitted to. So you end up with data that's GPS fitted, so it's accurately located, and you might have structural information from deflectograph survey. You might have scanner surveys, which will give you a detailed understanding of the surface condition, and then skid resistance. And the tools and techniques are to turn all of that data into information to enable you to carry out and plan works. So I would say it's part of an asset management strategy. It does lend itself sometimes to lower cost treatments that can be quite cost effective and improve the whole life cycle plan. The classic asset management strategy is you start with a new road and you intervene in midlife to improve its serviceability, which is where skid resistance can help. But also it's a means of articulating and demonstrating where your priorities lie in terms of treatment over time.
Another question I had, and as I said, you've kind of touched on it again, is if an authority wanted to improve its skid resistance strategy tomorrow, what do you think is the first thing it should focus on?
I think there's different approaches. So there is a national standard. It is a standard developed for the strategic road network. And whilst significant aspects of it are transferable, I very much believe that a local authority should tailor their approach to their network and the knowledge and understanding they have of their network. I think there is a process of deciding to what extent you survey. So do you just survey your A roads? Do you survey other roads as well? One thing I would advocate, and it is a more detailed analysis, is to do some evidence-based research for your particular local authority. So it's a process where you can link your crash history, your skid resistance, and start to really understand how your network's performing. And that can be used to set your own local standards. It can be used to inform your prioritization process. But it does require high quality data. You need traffic data, you need crash data, you need skid resistance data to do that. The alternative is you work with peer authorities to try and get a policy strategy that works with your neighbours. Many years ago, we did some work for the 32 London boroughs and Transport for London and tried to implement a London-wide skid policy with a fair degree of success. And I think there is some power in working collaboratively with adjoining authorities to sort of articulate how you want your road network to perform.
So moving just slightly away from that, we're going to focus on actually the scrim machine a little bit more now. Yeah. Can you give us a little bit of, an overview of the scrim machine, how it works, what data it collects, and how effective it can be for these skid resistance strategies?
So the scrim survey vehicle that we know in the UK, New Zealand, and the United States has evolved from some early research carried out in the 1930s, and it was scaled to be deployed on vehicles probably in the 70s and 80s as a systematic tool. And what we're doing as we survey is we've got the test wheel, which you can see in front of us, which is set at an angle to the direction of travel. That wheel is always trying to straighten itself, and you're measuring the force of it trying to straighten itself, and you're expressing that as effectively a measure of skid resistance. We collect data pretty continuously, but generally for reporting, we bundle it up into a 10-meter average. Mm-hmm. We've got GPS on the vehicles, so you know exactly where that data was collected. And through the processing software in the W.D.M PMS, you then end up with a skid resistance profile, which compares it to preset investigatory levels. And that is the fundamental underpinning process, and it's applied across the world. Scrim is a tool that enables you to survey a network. We can get a range of approximately 100 kilometres plus for every single water fill. So within a day, it's not out of the question to do 200 or 300 lane kilometres of survey. The process is covered by an annual accreditation process in the UK, so you can be confident that a WDM scrim is providing you consistent data. We run a fleet of 8 to 10 scrims in the UK, so you also know that we're monitoring the fleet and identifying if a particular vehicle is measuring differently to the others. And the standards that we apply in the UK have been derived and developed from scrim. So there are other methods of measuring skid resistance, which will go from what's known as the pendulum, the British pendulum, which is a spot treatment, a spot test that you can essentially measure a very small discrete area. I've used it on white lines and I've used it on footpaths, but I've not used it as a network tool. You get the grip tester, which is a towed trailer. It has some flexibility in its use, but it's not subject to the annual correlation trials that the scrim are. So you do tend to have to take a single grip tester and compare it to itself rather than to a fleet average.
I was going to ask you a bit more about New Zealand and the US and WDM's work there. I understand that it has, had some really positive effects. Is there anything you can kind of add in terms of, how we work over there and the benefits in those countries?
I know more about the New Zealand project than the US, so I'll talk about New Zealand first and then a little bit about the US. So in New Zealand, in the mid-90s, there was a drive to improve network safety, and their network is defined, largely speaking, by curves in their terminology, and they knew that most of their crashes were happening on curves. So they were looking at a way of improving that performance. And as I said, they went through an evaluation process and decided scrim was the approach they would use. And they've been doing on the state highway network testing now for 30 years. We've just completed the 30th year of skid resistance surveys in New Zealand. And the data we collect is deeply embedded into how New Zealand work, and they have a number of processes they follow through as a consequence of the data and the skid resistance surveys. So the first one is exception reporting, where they are looking to react quickly to areas that are identified as challenging. They then have a process of identifying what they call flushing, which is where there's excess binder on the road surface that's compromising road safety. And then finally, they have the programmed interventions that follow on from the survey data by using a prioritisation model to identify sites. And in New Zealand, they top slice the budget to carry out those treatments. Over the period they've been doing it, I think that they would suggest that they've saved over 100 lives, and probably somewhere around 800 to 1,000 serious in accidents. The USA's been a much later adopter of skid resistance, and I think the drive came from Federal Highways probably about 10 years ago, and the drive there is very much to improve road safety. They have a significant number of, they call them roadway departure crashes, so it's vehicles leaving the carriageway. Kentucky have been the pathfinder for the work, so that's Kentucky Transportation Committee, and we've been carrying out surveys on their network for a number of years, and we've done a significant amount of analysis to identify the risk sites, the nature of the types of sites where intervention would work quite well. And a common theme emerges: it tends to be rural bends on high speed roads.
Really now looking towards the future. So we know in this country, in the UK, certainly, local authorities need to be very kind of cost aware. Resources are, really valuable. And of course, we want to maintain safe roads. Can you kind of give me an overview of how you see kind of skid resistance evolving and how, SCRIM might be able to support people into the future?
I think that skid resistance has demonstrated over many years to be an effective measuring and implementing skid resistance strategies is an effective countermeasure to improve road safety. We've now reached a point in the UK where you don't tend to get the sites that stand out as having significant safety concerns, or if they do, the solutions might be very, very costly. But you can look at routes, you can look at a series of roads that go from A to B and say, how do you improve the route as a whole to provide a sort of consistent messages to the road users? So skid resistance is part of that. So if you're coming to a bend, you can, through signing and road markings, indicate the severity of the bend. But indicating the severity of the bend and not maintaining a skid resistance doesn't really help anybody. So I think there's that element there. I'm an advocate of network surveys complemented by more targeted surveys. Yeah. So if you have sites or lengths of road that you're concerned about that aren't on your routine monitoring program, I would suggest talk to us, because we can always do a one-off survey and quantify whether there is an issue or not. The other areas I think that potentially will help, possibly the local authority engineers, would be in some of the other data strands that are coming from things like connected vehicles. So there's models that show where harsh braking occurs, but equally speed is a key determiner of outcome from any incident on the road. So if you get quality speed data from connected vehicles, you might be able to target sites more effectively, knowing whether the speed is appropriate for that particular location or not, as the case may be. So I think the connected vehicles can complement network skid resistance, but I'm not convinced at this point that it can replace it.
Skid resistance really and the use of SCRIM is going to be relevant for as long as we're driving cars on the road, I guess. Really, just to kind of finish off then today, you've given us some really good information, a lot to go away and think about. But can you kind of maybe sort of finish up with, if local authorities are to take one thing away from this conversation today, what would you hope that would be? I
don't think there's any magic bullets, but but I do think that you have to think about policy strategy. So how you actually use the data, setting investigatory levels, and thinking about whether the ones that you're applying are appropriate to your network. But fundamentally, I think it comes down to the implementation of strategies using that data. So you've got a documented investigatory process, you keep your records, and you're making objective decisions about where to intervene and where not to intervene. One of the engineers from Transport Scotland frames their skid policy in terms of we spend a lot of time and money deciding what not to do. And I think that's quite a nice message, because it's not always about carrying out interventions, about understanding and putting the data into the context of your own network and making judgments based on that and the priorities of your particular authority.
Thanks for joining us. So if you're looking to strengthen your skid resistance strategy, improve how you use friction data, or move towards more proactive network management, we'd love to continue the conversation. Visit WDM's website to learn more about our scrim surveying, pavement friction management, and data analysis services. See you next time.